welcome to another episode of D.O.T. Explained. This time, I will be elaborating further into arguably the most crucial character in all of D.O.T. lore. He is the Pioneer, Subject Zero, the Alpha, whatever you want to call him. I am, of course, talking about none other than...
And his name is John C.
No, but seriously, let's get on with the show. Luckily for us, Edwin wasn't a nobody. He actually made a name for himself in history books, and many people that have never heard nor ever will hear about D.O.T. have heard of Edwin. Born December 20th, 1838, this fellow would eventually become a scholar in the areas of literature and theology, publishing all sorts of written works in those areas. One of his most notable works, and possibly most relevant in our case, is Flatland. I will elaborate more on this work and its parallels to Texel later. It is not so easy to pinpoint when exactly he found the wormhole, since the journal in which he documented all his observations regarding the incident states that the first wormhole he discovered, once he traveled back to Earth after his century-long visit, pooped him out only a few hours after he had initially traveled, so everyone was none the wiser. This wormhole is the S1E2 wormhole I mentioned in the previous episode, but there is a second wormhole documented in his journal which is referred to as Abbott 4 in the Junebug Tales. This second wormhole is even more eccentric, since Edwin notes having been pooped out several days before he left. No one has been able to find this second wormhole, not even the humans of the distant future written in the Junebug Tales. Perhaps this second wormhole is only accessible through Texel, a one-way passage, so to speak. But if that's the case, that means Edwin coexisted with his other self on Earth for a bit, which gets a little confusing, and the implications of such a theory may stagger even the brightest of minds. Instead, I opt to believe he simply got pooped, checked the time really quickly somehow, and went back through the wormhole before any crazier shenanigans happened, with the wormhole possibly collapsing on itself. No one really knows much about this second wormhole, and that is probably for the best. As I said earlier, he published many notable works in the fields of theology and literature, more specifically, philology. Now, you would think that he would have published at least one document about Texel, a world on the other side of a damn wormhole, cause how cool is that? However, he kept the existence of Texel and the wormhole a secret, never once telling anyone as far as we know. He died at the age of 87 in 1926, and so far, no one else has stumbled upon the wormhole wherever, however, and whenever he may have found it. I also mentioned Flatland, his only published work that incorporated mathematical ideas to such a degree. That's because even though Edwin studied literature and theology extensively, he is not considered a mathematician. However, Flatland, published in 1884, during a time when non-Euclidean geometry and higher dimensions were still in their infancy, contains pages upon pages of abstract mathematics not truly appreciated nor recognized until roughly 4 decades later, when Einstein's theory of general relativity gained traction, and people started taking the existence of higher dimensions a little more seriously. Curious how somebody with barely any mathematical background was able to write this entire novella, and so accurately at that. Well, anyway, this work begins with a two-dimensional character writing about his hierarchical society, in which social strata are separated by which polygons have more sides. For instance, an octagon would be considered higher in society than a triangle. Women, being line segments, are considered second-class citizens at the very bottom. At the very top of society are clerical circles, the ideal shape, who maintain the status quo at all costs, even via executions. This is meant to be a satirical work, and there have been countless of scholars who have already analyzed his work through the lens of England's society during the late 19th century. On the other hand, as someone who has analyzed Texelic culture and know of Edwin's dirty little secrets, I find it hard to ignore the possible connections this story holds. If my theory is correct, and Edwin traveled to Texel shortly before he wrote this novella, then perhaps Flatland is his way of getting his experiences off his chest in a surreptitious manner. This hierarchical society is reminiscent of Texelic society before the end of the war. There were 3 tribes, Sana, Thuri, and Hemi. Sana were the most human-like Texelian who believed themselves to be above all other tribes. Among Sana were 3 major groups, Gallants, who were arrogant and authoritarians, Mages, who were pompous and self-indulgent, and Barbarians, who revered nature and sought a more ascetic lifestyle. These would easily map onto the priestly circles from Flatland. Thuri, on the other hand, lacked a human appearance and were more akin to mythical creatures. This tribe mostly dedicated themselves to philosophy, astrology, and the arts. Rather than arrogantly proclaiming to be higher than the other tribes, they usually had an indifference to other tribes and mostly kept to themselves. Hemi is the special tribe. These would be the pariahs described in Flatland, mostly doomed to forever remain at the bottom of the social ladder. Hemi were considered abominations of nature as they were the bastard children born from a union between a Sana and a Theri. Although not actively persecuted, these creatures were shunned and pushed to the outskirts of other societies. Basically, as long as they minded their own business and stayed far from anyone else's path, they would simply be ignored as if they never existed. Unfortunately, they were by far the minority in Texel and could never seem to prosper, so they remained living under humble and meager conditions throughout the centuries. Back to Flatland, the main character, A Square, who describes the society, also recollects his experiences with the Sphere before being incarcerated. The Sphere was a three-dimensional being who wanted to open the eyes of two-dimensional beings. Every 1,000 years, the Sphere would descend to Flatland in hopes of recruiting more apostles who would spread the word of the third dimension. However, every 1,000 years, a council was formed to eradicate society from anyone who dared speak of their revelations. They were so adamant about silencing these apostles that when the Sphere descended upon a council meeting, guardsmen and some members of the Grand Council were eternally imprisoned for having borne witness to the Sphere. This explains why the protagonist, A Square, wrote the entirety of the novella from his prison cell 7 years after being jailed for daring to profess his visions at a local town meeting. Could this aspect of Flatland be a glimpse into Edwin's state of mind upon returning from Texel? Perhaps Edwin saw himself as someone who had borne witness to forbidden knowledge the world around him was not ready to accept. Perhaps he kept his knowledge locked away in the back of his mind, in fear of the ramifications of his revelations. No one may know for sure. Perhaps Edwin wrote the novella before he ever found the wormhole, and all my superstitions are naught but gibberish. Well, that'll be it for this episode. I just wanted to touch on this illustrious Edwin Abbott, but this episode does not really explain why I called him the most important character in all of the D.O.T lore. I mean, what's so important about some dude that kept his observations secret for centuries? I don't want this episode to become a 1-hour documentary, so we'll just call it quits here. On the next episode, we will take a look at the little we have archived of Edwin's notebook describing Texel.